It's been said that every family has a ghost story. Perhaps it's exactly as scientists and other experts have said that it's just a chemical reaction in our brains that makes us imagine the things that go bump in the night. Maybe a gas leak or a sickness or any number of things that cause us to believe that ghosts and monsters are real, to see things that we can't explain or experience events that years later cause us to break into a cold sweat at its very memory. I think it's more accurate to say that there are two types of people in this world: those that have experienced a supernatural event and thus believe in the various myths, and those that have not and thus choose to think that the other group are either crazy or deluded and try to explain away the events with science. For the non-believers, it's almost impossible for them to take the supernatural seriously. They have no frame of reference to allow them to connect with believers, and so they continue to try to explain away the mystery that surrounds our experiences. For believers, it's almost impossible for us to believe that non-believers can take our experiences seriously. Once you throw in religion, things go from disbelief to heated far too quickly. It's frustrating and confusing for both sides, but regardless of the belief in the supernatural, one thing can be agreed upon by both sides. There are things in this world that are beyond explanation. My family has a whole mess of supernatural stories. As a child, I was always fascinated by the stories my grandfather would tell me. I thought the idea of ghosts was no different than the Saturday morning cartoons I would watch. Entertaining, but certainly not real. He'd always tell me a story, emphasizing the most important of remembering the details. Remembering what to look for, and would always end the story in the same way. "Just wait," he'd say. "Wait until something happens. You'll understand then." I'd laugh it off and go play with Legos or pretend to be a soldier with sticks. The usual kid stuff. I never considered that he was telling me the truth. I always thought that he was trying to scare me with his tales of ghosts and mystery. Young, naive, and so utterly wrong. As it turns out, he was right. He was so entirely right. When my something happened, I had ignored all the signs he'd always pressed me to remember and forgotten the importance of the stories he'd told. Looking back, it's hard for me to believe that I was ever so foolish. But again, for a non-believer, there isn't a frame of reference. It's hard to believe when you've never experienced something you can't explain. Maybe I can blame it on the foolishness of youth, but it's more fair to say that I was simply stupid. I was 13 when it happened. There's some backstory that needs to be explained before I delve into the event. I have two older brothers. The younger of the two, Evan, was always the good boy. He never got into trouble, or more accurately, never got caught getting into trouble. After high school, he got married and joined the military. Him and his wife had a daughter and lived the normal military life stationed in Alaska. My oldest brother, Colin, had a different path. It is going to be the focus of this tale. Colin was remarkably smart, but lacked any common sense. By the time he was 15, he'd already got pulled into a life of drug abuse. At the time of his high school graduation, he already had a son with a girl named Michelle and barely managed to scrape enough credits to graduate. After high school, Colin fell in love with a girl named Sarah. She was the daughter of the largest meth dealer in the state we're living in. Colin and Sarah soon married, due to the fact that he'd once again thought with his penis and got her pregnant as well. I think it was likely due to his fear of her father that he married her, but regardless, they were married. Soon after, Caden was born. A few months passed before the family began to notice problems with Caden. Doctors would eventually diagnose him with Asperger's, a form of autism. which caused the little guy to deal poorly with any change in his daily routine. Issues happened in their happy family that are far too personal to me, but to make the details short, they soon divorced. Colin eventually met another woman named Gloria, and by the time Caden was 18 months old, they were living together. And that is where our story starts. As the youngest brother, I was always a bit of an outcast. There's a 7-year difference between me and Colin, and I, as the youngest brother, I wanted to spend as much time as possible with my cooler brother. Colin had moved into a dinky trailer at the edge of town, and I often spent the night at his place, playing Gran Turismo with him on PlayStation, learning how to play poker, and generally trying to be older than I was. The trailer he lived in was the typical design, with the kitchen and living room in the same space, and a narrow hallway leading to the 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. Caden's room was on the first door to the left, then a bathroom, and then my brother's bedroom. The first night I stayed with him, he'd only lived there for a few weeks and still only had the bare minimum furniture. A small couch that was just barely fit my 13-year-old frame, an entertainment center, and not much else. I had settled into the couch as he turned off the lights in the trailer and bid me good night. I was barely 11, but Colin had to work in the morning, and he didn't want to keep me awake with video games. In the dark, the trailer had an odd feeling to it. There wasn't any reason for it, but I found myself searching around the darkness every few minutes, looking for something I couldn't see. I had a feeling, a gut-twisting feeling, that there was something more to the surroundings, but I couldn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Eventually, sleep overtook me. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I remember distinctly reaching for my glasses so I could see. I figured my brother had woken up to get a glass of water or something. The couch was positioned in the living room, parallel with the hallway, and I lay with my head towards the bedrooms. I twisted my neck, expecting to see my brother, and instead saw nothing, just darkness, with absolutely no motion. With my heart pounding in my chest, I slowly walked down the hallway to my brother's room, and found him and Gloria sleeping soundly in their bed. I was stunned. I knew I'd heard footsteps. I tried to explain it away in my head, thinking maybe it was the trailer settling into its supports, or the wind, or anything other than what my gut was already telling me. I was scared, but I knew my brother would only make fun of me if I woke him up, so instead I retired back to my couch. I figured I'd be too scared to sleep, but surprisingly, I was out in minutes and didn't wake up till the morning. I kept the events of that night to myself, thinking that my brother would poke fun of me for it, but to my surprise it wasn't necessary. Soon Colin began to tell us of strange things he was experiencing in the little trailer he lived in, waking up to the feeling of something watching him, hearing footsteps moving through the living room and kitchen, seeing motion out of the corner of his eye, things that had no explanation. My parents responded the way I expected Colin to respond to me, jokes and mockery, with the occasional whispers of drug use when he wasn't around. Colin didn't exactly have a strong track record, and my parents often assumed he was either high or delusional. I felt differently, but I had no way to prove it to them, even after telling them my own experience. I think they would have kept thinking the way they did were it not for Caden. As I said earlier, Caden was diagnosed with Asperger's, and because of that, he had to be kept on a very strict schedule or he'd freak out. Everything had to happen in the same order every day or he'd go into kind of a panic attack. Absolutely ballistic freakouts. One of his constants was his bedtime. He'd go to bed at 8:30 every single night without failure. Usually he'd cry for about 20 minutes and then pass out. That was always the routine. For roughly a month, that's how he'd fall asleep. The night it changed was the second night I agreed to stay at the trailer. Colin had invited me over to play poker, and despite my hesitation, I decided to go. Caden went to bed at his normal time, and his cries echoed through the trailer as usual. Colin was asking me about school, and I was telling him about my history class, when the trailer suddenly went silent. I distinctly remember the look on Colin's face, a mix of surprise and worry. Caden had only been in his room for about 10 minutes, and it was unheard of him for him to cry for less than 20. My brother rose from the couch and took one step toward the hallway when we heard it. Laughter. The trailer was dead silent as we listened to my nephew giggle in happiness. I followed Colin to Caden's room, and we found the boy standing in his crib, staring at the far corner of his room, a huge grin on his face. He giggled again as Colin came into the room and turned on the light. Then he started to babble in the usual infant speak. Colin searched around the room, but nothing seemed unusual, besides its being slightly warmer than the hallway and living room. It was concerning, but it's hard to be worried for a toddler when he's happy. We left Caden to fall asleep, and within half an hour he was zonked out, with another scream or cry. It was unusual, and in hindsight, exceptionally creepy, but at the time, Colin was willing to accept the change in his son's behavior. Being the young teenager, I found it mysterious and exciting. I knew it was connected to the strange events, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. That night, lying on the couch in the dark, I tried to fight sleep, and kept my eyes and ears open to the surroundings, watching and waiting for something to happen. I might as well have stayed home and slept in my own bed. The trailer was dark and silent, with nothing out of the ordinary. My imagination ran wild with thoughts of speaking with spirits, of seeing definite proof of my grandfather's stories. I lay awake for maybe an hour, watching and waiting, but eventually I fell asleep disappointed. I woke again to footsteps. I was awake instantly, but in a flash of insight, I didn't open my eyes and sit up. I lay there, perfectly still, trying to control my breathing. The steps seemed light, as if it were another teenager moving through the trailer. I strained to listen, trying to picture where the person would be in relation to me. I decided to sleep with my feet towards the bedroom, and if I opened my eyes, I'd be able to see straight down the hallway. I wanted to wait until I was sure I'd see what was making the noise. The footsteps were closer now, right beside me. I felt sweat begin to dampen my shirt, and I shook lightly, but still I kept my eyes closed. Not so much in curiosity now, but fear. The steps stopped, and silence once again filled the room. I lied there for a minute, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of my face, tickling me. I tried to ignore it, but I'm very ticklish and I couldn't. I tried to be casual as I quickly raised a hand to wipe it away. My hand touched flesh inches from my face. I gasped. My eyes flew open, searching wildly around myself. The room was empty, silent. I started to shake, and tears stung my eyes. Fumbling for the switch to the lamp beside the couch, I managed to flick it on, still searching for any motion or movement as I pulled my glasses on. There was nothing to indicate a person in the room, but I still felt as though something was there, something I couldn't see. A glance at the oven clock told me it was just after 1 a.m., but still there was no motion. I stared in the light for maybe half an hour, trying to calm myself down. I had felt something, but it hadn't done anything harmful. I tried to explain what it might have been, and eventually managed to convince myself that maybe in my half-awake state I'd just touched my own face and didn't realize it. Not a very solid explanation, but it managed to calm me down enough to fall asleep. The next morning, I told my brother what had happened. I thought he'd joke about it, but to my surprise, he didn't. He took what I said completely seriously, and together we tried to think of what it might have been. Thinking back, maybe he was just trying to make me feel better about what had happened, but at the time I felt relieved that he believed me. He dropped me off at home soon after, and over the next week I decided that I was going to get to the bottom of it. It took most of 2 days to forget the fear I'd felt at the feeling of touching invisible flesh, and I wanted answers to what was happening in my brother's home. It was another week before I stayed at my brother's place again. By then, my parents had heard of Caden's little friend, as my mother called it, and had even come to Colin's trailer around the boys' bedtime to hear it themselves. They couldn't explain it any better than we could, and instead laughed it off as a strange but fairly harmless phenomenon. I believed otherwise, and I think Colin did as well, though he wouldn't admit it to our parents. Friday came and I found myself at Colin's trailer once again. This time I came over ready to prove that the trailer was haunted. I had borrowed my parents' video recorder, an old over-the-shoulder camera with a VCR slot. I knew from past use that I'd only be able to get maybe 2 hours of recording, but I'd take what I could. What I wasn't expecting was Colin getting invited to a party at the trailer next door to his. As it turns out, he wanted me to sleep over so I could keep an ear out for Caden while he and Gloria went to the party. I was scared to be alone in the trailer, but I didn't want to admit that to my brother, so I agreed. Caden was asleep by 9, having his usual laughter and giggling before he finally passed out. I kept more lights on than was necessary and played games on my brother's PlayStation, trying to keep myself calm. This plan was interrupted by a noise coming from my brother's room, a noise I'd heard often enough in the previous time I'd slept over. Squeaking coming from the old metal bed frame my brother used. Any motion on that bed caused noise that, while not loud, was definitely noticeable. I initially didn't think anything of it, since it was a familiar sound, but soon enough I realized why it was making me so nervous. I was alone in the trailer, and Colin didn't have any pets. My initial reaction was to run to my brother and demand that he come home. I managed to keep myself from doing so, and instead slowly walked down the hallway to my brother's room. The noise was still happening, occasionally, as if someone was tossing and turning on the bed. I was scared, but I wasn't going to let it stop me. I was a few steps from the room when it stopped completely. Silence once again filled the trailer, and I quickly entered the room and turned on the light. The bed was still made from that morning and empty. I searched the little room, but there weren't many places a person could hide. The fear was starting to make me shake again, but I tried my best to keep from freaking out. I left the room, turning off the light as I went, and glanced down the hallway toward the living room, just in time to see the slightest bit of movement, as if just barely seeing someone's back as they turned a corner. I hurried to the living room, expect to find my brother or Gloria. The living room was empty. I stood in shock, trying to figure out what had made the motion. Once again I found myself searching the trailer, but nothing was there. The front door was badly fit to the frame and made a ton of noise when it opened, so I knew no one had slipped out. As I sat back down on the couch trying to calm my breathing, I happened to glance down the hallway again. The light in my brother's room was on. I stared down the hallway for most of a minute, trying to explain why the light was on. I knew without a doubt that I'd turned the light off. My dad was very strict with leaving lights on in my own house, and turning off a switch when leaving a bedroom was muscle memory to me. I didn't want to go back down the hall, but I needed to get to the bottom of it. Nervously, I made my way down the hallway once again, my breathing heavy. I nervously peeked my head into my brother's room, but nothing had changed since I'd last been in it. I quickly flicked off the switch again, making sure that it was all the way down, and retreated back to the living room. At this point, my 13-year-old courage had expired, and I'd quickly pulled my shoes on and went next door to find my brother. I told him what had happened and begged him to come back to the trailer so I wouldn't be alone. Maybe it's a testament to my brother's love of me that he agreed, but I think it's more likely that he was just as scared of the trailer as I was and didn't want to leave me alone there. We returned to his home, and he quickly searched the kitchen and living room for anything out of the ordinary. I was talking with Gloria as Colin went back to his bedroom, but was shocked into silence when he called out to me. "Hey, Mike, were you playing in my bed?" I nervously walked to his bedroom for the third time that night and peered into his room. He was standing next to his bed, frowning at it, and it took me a second to register what I was seeing. The comforter was pushed to the edge of the bed, rumpled together into a lump. The sheet was likewise pushed back, and half the fitted sheet was torn off, exposing the white fabric of the mattress itself. The bed looked as if someone had been thrashing around in it, and the frown on Colin's face told me he wasn't playing a prank on me. "It wasn't me," I whispered. Gloria always made the bed in the morning. I had seen it neatly set up not half an hour earlier, but here it was, torn apart. Once again, a shiver of fear went down my spine as I met my brother's gaze. I could tell he was trying to keep a straight face for my sake, but the nervous fear in his eyes betrayed the look on his face. Colin and Gloria drank that night. Being 13, I obviously wasn't allowed, but I still sat with them as they talked. I suggested setting the camera up, and Colin agreed. We set up a stack of books and movies to give the camera a bit more height and positioned it to look down the hallway over my head. I was still scared, but having hard evidence of the things we were experiencing gave me the courage I needed to sleep on the couch for the third time. We stayed up for another hour or so, getting everything ready, but around midnight they bid me good night. I hit the record button, settled down on the couch, and killed the lights. I thought I'd be too scared to sleep, but once again I found myself out in minutes. To my utter surprise, I woke up when the sun was starting to peek through the curtains of a window. I'd slept through the night with nothing crazy happening. I quickly checked the camera and found the tape fully wound on the other side of the spindle, meaning it had recorded through the whole cassette. I found myself grinning at the prospect of finally having something to prove we weren't all crazy. I had the tape in the VCR and ready for Colin when he woke up. I was originally going to watch it myself, but managed to convince myself to wait. I had no idea what to expect and didn't want to see something unexpected without my brother. He got himself a cup of coffee and settled into the couch beside me. I hit play, and together, in silence, we watched the tape. It was an old-school style recorder with all the time stamp and recording information around the edge of the screen. The picture was darker than I'd hoped, but we were still able to make out general shapes of the living room. The hallway, unfortunately, was pitch black. For the first hour, nothing happened. I watched myself toss and turn a few times on the couch, and I started getting bored. Colin got another cup of coffee, and together we kept a close eye on anything that might happen. By the time of 1 hour 15 minutes, I was ready to write the idea off as a failure. Colin had just stood up and was walking into the kitchen again when we heard it. It was very quiet, but there was nothing else for sound on the video, and as I turned the volume up to full, it was easily recognizable. Footsteps. Colin froze and had his full attention on the TV. We strained to see, but there was no movement. The footsteps lasted maybe 10 seconds and stopped. My brother quickly paused the tape and rewound. This time he fiddled with the controls on the TV, adjusting the brightness and tint of the screen until the hallway was as clear as he could make it. Again we watched the 10 seconds, but still no motion was visible. "Maybe it was in the kitchen or behind the camera," I said quietly. Colin nodded in agreement, and we let the tape continue. For 2 minutes there was no motion, no sound. Then at 1 hour 18 minutes, another sound rose to the TV, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. 2 clicks followed by a quiet, rumbling laugh. It was faint, and even with the volume all the way up, barely recognizable, but it was obviously a laugh. Colin and I looked at each other in shock when a burst of static erupted from the screen. We both jumped in surprise, and I quickly turned the volume down. The static had turned the screen into a typical no-signal screen of old TVs. We watched the screen for a few minutes, but video didn't return. Colin paused the VCR, and we found that the static was on the tape, but not the TV. He fast-forwarded the tape and ran it to the end, but no video had followed. "What the hell is going on?" Colin whispered to himself and rewound the tape. He'd stop every 15 seconds or so, trying to find the spot with the laugh again. It was 2 minutes before he found video again, with the timestamp saying 1 hour 13 minutes. We let it run for the few minutes, waiting for the footsteps, but something unexpected happened. Just as the timestamp hit 1 hour 15 minutes, the video burst into static again. We sat motionless for most of a minute, watching the static. Colin mumbled to himself and rewound the tape again, but no matter how many times he tried, the tape wouldn't play past 1 hour 15 minutes. We had both seen it. We had both heard the footsteps, heard the laugh, the clicks, but we couldn't prove it without the tape. My brother cursed and turned off the VCR, throwing the remote onto his coffee table. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us likely thinking the same thing. What in the hell was going on? "I think I might need to move," he finally said, and I let out a nervous laugh. "You think?" I replied, and he laughed in response. The laughter seemed to give us strength, and we started making breakfast together. After Caden and Gloria were up, my brother started talking about moving. Gloria agreed without argument, and they started making plans together. We spent the day hanging out, playing games, and generally trying to stay busy. My parents had friends from out of town visiting, and I committed to staying the weekend at Colin's place, meaning one last night on his couch. I was scared, but I hoped at least I'd be able to sleep through the night again. Turns out I should have hoped a bit harder. The last night in his trailer turned out to be the biggest tipping point. After dinner, Colin and I got into a pretty intense competition of Madden, while Gloria got Caden laid down for bed. As usual, his giggles occasionally flowed through the trailer as he played with his little friend, and I was in the midst of beating my brother's digital ass in football. I was choosing a play with the only sound coming from the TV being the dull cheering in the background from a digital crowd, when Caden suddenly stopped giggling. At first we didn't notice, focused as we were on the TV, but Gloria did, interrupting us with a whispered word. We paused and listened, realizing that he'd suddenly felt silent after only a few minutes of being in his room. Colin muted the TV, and silence fell in the trailer. That's when the screaming started. When I say screaming, I'm not talking about a toddler that's throwing a temper tantrum. This is a scream that I will never forget as long as I live. A scream at a pitch so loud it was almost like a physical thing, washing over me like a cold wave of water. A scream of such intensity that Colin rocked back in shock and surprise. It was only for a moment that we sat frozen, but it felt like eternity. The next moment we were moving. Colin was up first, but close to the hallway, but I was close on his heels. Caden's scream still echoed through the trailer as Colin rushed to his door and threw it open. He took one step inside and suddenly lurched back, as if someone had hit him in the chest. The motion pushed him into me, and I stabilized him with a hand to his back. I gave him a light shove forward, and we rushed into the room. It was cold, so impossibly cold. It was a midsummer in the state we lived in. Even at 8:30 in the evening, the temperature outside was still in the 80s. Colin had a dinky little swamp cooler that he managed to keep the temperature in the trailer bearable, but only just. Caden's room felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My brother hit the light switch, and for the barest moment, for the tiniest sliver of time, I saw the light seem to fight against a shadow in the corner of Caden's room. In that sliver of time, I knew that Caden wasn't the only one in the room, and when I felt the shiver run down my spine, I knew it wasn't only from the cold. My nephew was frozen in shock. He was pushed as hard as he could be into the corner of his crib. His eyes were enormous, far larger than I would have thought possible. Likewise, his mouth was stretched open impossibly wide, and little sounds tried to escape his throat. His little face was chalk white, his lips a faint shade of blue. His tremors ran through him as his overly wide eyes stared at the same corner of the room I'd seen the shadow. The same corner he was trying to get as far away from as possible. Colin had pushed for only a second, but he quickly scooped Caden up and pulled him from the room, rushing past me to get him out. I stayed for a few seconds longer, staring at the corner, watching as hard as I could, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Another shiver ran down my spine as I turned to leave, and as I flicked off the light, I heard it again, almost a whisper, damn near impossible to hear. 2 clicks and a quiet, rumbling laugh. I closed the door and rushed to my brother and nephew. Colin held his son tightly, bound up in a heavy 49ers blanket. Within a few minutes, his face was normal color again, and he cried quietly into my brother's chest. As soon as Colin was sure his son was okay, we packed up and left. Colin made a few calls and eventually found a place to stay the night and dropped me off at my parents' house. We told them what had happened, and the look on both of our faces assured them that they had no room to doubt our claim. The next day, my brother and I returned to the trailer and spent the entire day packing. We rushed as fast as we could and had everything loaded into my dad's truck well before dark. We did one last walkthrough of the trailer to make sure we'd gotten everything, and finally headed for the door. As I walked through but paused as my brother stopped at the edge of the doorway. He stood there with his head bowed for a few seconds. Then I turned around, looking into the empty trailer. I stood frozen, worried that something had happened, when I heard him quietly speak to the room. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but the cold fury in it scared me almost as much as the events in the past few weeks. Like Caden's scream, I'll never forget what he said. "Stay away from my son." With that, my brother turned and never looked back. He stayed with my parents and me for a few days while he and Gloria worked out the issues with finding a new place to live. I wish I could say the story ended here, but it didn't. Years later, as a recent high school graduate, I found a job as a pizza delivery driver for Pizza Hut. In a small town we lived in, it was easy to end up delivering to places you might not want to. One regular, uneventful night, I found myself pulling up to that old, terrifying trailer with a pizza in hand. The guy that answered the door seemed like a normal enough person, and I hesitated for a moment in my desire to ask him if he'd noticed anything. Instead, as he was paying, I casually made mention that my brother used to live in this exact same trailer. The guy froze for a fraction of a second, and I had the sense that he was picking his words carefully. Did he ever have anything weird happen to him here? I stared at him in shock for a moment, but recovered enough to give him a condensed version of what had happened to my brother. I imagine if I'd told anyone else about it, they would have looked at me like I was crazy, but this guy held on to every word I spoke like it was the word of God. He mumbled his thanks, and I turned to leave. Before I'd taken a single step, I heard it. A whisper of sound, barely audible. 2 clicks and a quiet, rumbling laugh. I quickly returned to my car and never looked back.